Curious people? Welcome back to another episode of Curious People Wanted here at the Barnum Museum in Bridgeport, Connecticut. My name is Adrienne Saint-Pierre, and I'm the curator of the collections. You know, I sometimes feel like a detective when I find things in our collection that have been here a really long time, but for which there isn't much information, perhaps only a clue or two. This coat is the perfect example. It's been here at least since the mid-1890s, back when this was the Barnum Institute of Science and History. And it definitely looks like it has seen better days. It's black wool, but is now very faded, and most of the buttons are missing. Do you think maybe some gentleman accidentally left it behind after attending one of the Barnum Institute's lectures? You might think so, and that the staff expected the owner to return for it, like a couple of much newer coats we've had on our coat rack for a while. So I'll tell you what I know from looking at it and then what clues we have to work with, and I'm sure you'll be intrigued when you learn who this belonged to. This is a man's coat from the mid-1800s, made of black wool, as I said, and it's quilted throughout the inside, and we'll look at that in a minute. There are a couple of interesting buttons on the front, kind of a handsome checkerboard design, but we can also see where there were once other buttons that have since disappeared. It's a double-breasted coat, meaning that there were 2 rows of buttons fastening it, so there were originally 8 buttons. The collar is pretty simple, flat collar, and not very thick or stiff, not something you'd pull up against your neck in the cold. What you probably noticed that seems rather different is that the sleeves are quite wide. They flare out at the bottom. In fact, if you look at the overall silhouette, the body of the coat flares out too, so it has this kind of triangular look. So that shape tells me that this dates to about 1860, possibly the late 1850s or maybe up to the mid-1860s, because that is when women's fashion had both wide skirts and wide sleeves. And you say, but this is a man's coat, right? Well, in period fashion, you almost always see a correlation between the overall silhouettes in men's and women's attire. So even though these wide sleeves look a little strange to us for a man's garment, they fit with that period of women's fashion when the silhouette was triangular. I was actually tempted to put this on a form so you could see the shape better, but the interior is so fragile that I just felt it would cause more damage. So I'm just laying it out for you to see here instead. Most importantly, I also wanted you to see the amazing quilting inside. Running vertically inside both front edges, there's this beautiful feather pattern quilting. This is all hand quilted. And this just along the front opening. The rest of it is kind of a utilitarian quilting, forming a little grid there. And then inside the sleeves, we see a diamond pattern in the quilting, but all by hand. In fact, every area of stitching that I've looked at on this coat seems to be hand sewn. And you notice that all of the edges have a narrow black binding on them to kind of finish the edges, and that reduces the bulk, so you don't have heavy hems around the bottom or the sleeves. The coat's lining is black silk twill, or it was. But as you can see, there's a lot of loss and change of color, probably from light exposure, just like the black wool. However, the silver lining to the loss of the black lining is that we can actually see the layers inside. That's material that would normally be hidden. So up here, you see the batting. That's the filler that creates warmth, just like a bed quilt. And then there's this lighter tan color fabric, which is a backing fabric for the quilted sections. And it's woven with both wool and linen, which combine the properties of those 2 fibers to create a layer of warmth and to give stability and strength to the garment. Well, you might wonder if the coat is heavy, and while it's not lightweight, I certainly wouldn't call it a heavy winter coat, but it'd probably do for winter in conjunction with a man's suit. Okay, now let's turn to the clues. Those were the starting point for doing a little research to see if I could figure out why the coat came to be here. And I haven't told you yet who it belonged to. What we know about this comes from a note that was on the coat and a couple of lines of text in a 1936 inventory of collections. Overcoat, which belonged to Charles Dickens and was worn by him during a visit to Mr. George W. Childs. He gave it to Mr. Childs, and Mr. Childs gave it to P.T. Barnum, who presented it to the Bridgeport Historical Society. Then we have information from this huge ledger book, which lists some of the early donations given here. This little passage right here says the donor was Mrs. P.T. Barnum, and she gave this in July 24th, 1895. It says, coat owned and worn by Charles Dickens when he was on his last visit to America, sent to Mr. Barnum by George W. Childs of Philadelphia. And then we have one more little record offering us a clue. It says, Charles Dickens' coat, presented by P.T. Barnum, given to him by George W. Childs following November 1867. Charles Dickens, author of dozens of novels, essays, articles, and short stories, needs little introduction. Today, he is best known for his novella, A Christmas Carol. But, of course, many of his full-length novels, like David Copperfield, Bleak House, Oliver Twist, and A Tale of Two Cities, are almost as well known. Dickens was born in 1812, so he was a contemporary of P.T. Barnum's, actually, just 2 years younger, although his lifespan was much shorter. He died at age 58 in 1870, while Barnum lived another 21 years. Both men were extremely productive individuals in their lifetimes. Perhaps we'd call them workaholics today. Even when Charles Dickens was in poor health, his schedule for book readings was unrelenting and would have challenged even somebody in good health. So now if we start thinking like a detective, our clues tell us the chain of custody, Charles Dickens, the original owner, then George W. Childs, to whom the coat was given, then passed on to P.T. Barnum, and finally donated to the Historical Society, which became part of the Barnum Institute of Science and History in the 1890s. We also know from the clue that the coat dates from no later than 1867 or 1868, and it would be a safe bet that it was made at least a couple of years before that. In other words, it probably was not brand new when it changed hands. So we have our suspects and a time frame, but what about the motive? What would be the reason for Dickens leaving his coat with somebody? And then what was George Childs' reason for passing it on to Barnum, who apparently saved it and later donated it? That's what we have to figure out, right? To begin with, I needed to know more about George W. Childs and what connection he might have with Barnum. I'd heard his name. He was a 19th century publisher, but I didn't really know any details. So what's his story? Well, he was born in Baltimore, Maryland in 1829, so that makes him nearly 20 years younger than both Dickens and Barnum. One could say Childs was precocious. His gifts and talents emerged at an early age, and by the time he was 21, he was a partner in a publishing firm. Now, granted, the other partner was or soon became his father-in-law. This publishing firm was called Childs and Peterson, and Mr. Robert Peterson was apparently very knowledgeable in the fields of science, so they published serious books, like books on Arctic explorations, for example, and other kinds of texts like Critical Dictionary of English Literature, but not popular novels. In the partnership, George Childs was more of the business head. He had a kind of genius for marketing and promotion. For example, Childs and Peterson was the first publisher to use those little endorsement blurbs written by other famous people as a way to promote book sales. And Childs is said to have been the first to develop the idea of an author's book tour. But a career in book publishing was just not enough for Childs. From the time he was 18, when he had an office in the Philadelphia Public Ledger building, he had always wanted to own that newspaper. That opportunity came up during the Civil War when the paper was foundering. It was losing a ton of money each year, $150,000, which is a lot of money back then. Childs partnered with a financier, Anthony Drexel, to buy the paper for $20,000. And they turned it around. For one thing, changing its stance from being pro-secessionist, supporting the Copperheads, to pro-union. And Childs worked endless hours to make it successful, much as Barnum had done with his American Museum. Like Barnum, Childs was a very ambitious person with many different interests. There are definitely some parallels among their various enterprises, interests and aspirations they would have had in common. And their successes were of their own making, proverbial self-made men. And yet, they were not the type to ignore others. Both were very philanthropic-minded, Childs especially so. He was noted for being an extremely generous person, and he was outgoing with many friends, had a wide social network. Now, I don't know exactly how Barnum came to meet Childs, but it is certainly not a stretch to believe they knew each other, at least to some extent. Barnum was deeply interested in newspapers, promotion, publishing, literature, all of that. So if they did meet once, or on multiple occasions, they would have had plenty to talk about. So how did Childs come to know Charles Dickens? Again, I don't have an exact answer to that, but certainly they had book publishing in common. That said, Childs would have only been in his early teens when Dickens first came to America in the early 1840s. But that trip did not leave a favorable impression of America on Dickens. So it seems most likely Charles met him at a later point, probably in England. They did become close friends, and Childs even spent time at Dickens' home in England, Gad's Hill Place. Well, Dickens decided to give America a second chance, and he'd planned to make a visit to the U.S. in the early 1860s, but the outbreak of war changed that plan, and he did not make it across the puddle here until late 1867, which brings us to the date associated with our coat. Remember, one note said that Childs got the coat following November 1867. Dickens had arrived in America in November of 1867, and over the next 5 months, he was engaged in a whirlwind of appearances doing readings, mainly in Boston and New York, until early April when he returned to England. Wherever Dickens went, he drew immense crowds of admirers, and these were not quiet, bookish people. They were rabid fans who even tore his clothing trying to get souvenir bits of fabric. These celebrity seekers made his life absolutely miserable. He could not go anywhere without being mobbed and clawed at. People went crazy wanting to hear him because his readings weren't just readings, they were dramatic readings, and he mesmerized people by the way he spoke. And you get that from what you see in contemporary newspapers. The New York Herald, for instance, ran an ad in April announcing that his farewell readings would be at Steinway Hall. And on the same page, there were all of these other ads that somehow managed to include the name Charles Dickens, just to catch people's attention. I had to laugh when I noticed an ad for a Mr. W.M. Lingard, a comic vocalist and mimic from London, who included Dickens among his impersonations at the Theatre Comique on Broadway. It struck me as the SNL, Saturday Night Live, of its time. Anyway, you get the idea. Dickens was insanely popular at the time of his second trip to America. The return visit proved really stressful, if successful, and he continued to be under great stress when he returned to England, as an intense tour schedule had been lined up for him. Unfortunately, the strain of these tours took a toll on him, and he became gravely ill. He suffered at least 2 strokes between April of 1869 and June of 1870, and the last one caused his death on June 8th, 1870. So, back to the coat. What might be the reason that Childs gave Dickens' coat to Barnum? Here we have to think of the context. What was going on in Barnum's life at that time? You know that Barnum's first American museum burned in July of 1865. Then he reopened just a few months later in another location on Broadway. And then that museum was also consumed by fire less than 3 years later. The date of that fire was March 3rd, 1868. So that was within the time frame when Dickens was here in America. And from what I can tell in the newspapers, he seems to have been in New York City that spring. That made me think, well, maybe, just maybe, either he or Childs had the idea to help out by giving the coat to Barnum, helping to restock Barnum's inventory of curiosities, assuming that Barnum would open a museum again, which, as it turns out, he did not. After all, if Americans were tearing at Dickens' clothing, so desperate to have a souvenir of the great writer, putting Charles Dickens' coat on display at the American Museum was not far-fetched, conceivably a very desirable attraction. Well, maybe that is stretching the idea, but it's not implausible. We don't have any proof. Of course, Dickens may just have decided to leave his overcoat with Childs when he left to go back to England for a more ordinary reason. Maybe he'd had a new coat made for himself and just didn't want to be bothered taking the old one back. But if the coat was intended for Barnum to display, that probably never happened. However, I think we can be certain the Barnum Institute, where it ended up, did display it, and for a long time, hence the light damage we see. That's my take on it, but there may be some twist to the story, if you'll pardon the pun. And if you're watching this during the holiday season, maybe you'll take time to enjoy Dickens' Christmas Carol, now having a little different perspective on the author and his wardrobe. Thanks for joining me today, and I'll see you again on another episode of Curious People Wanted. Meantime, stay curious.